Today I wanted to talk about the production of the movie I scored for The Perks of Being a Wallflower, which was originally a novel by Stephen Chbosky. Here is the novel right here, and it's one of my favourite books of all time, which is one of the reasons why I chose this film. The movie follows the character Charlie, who is 15 going into high school. His best friend recently killed himself, and he has to go into high school all by himself with no friends, and until he meets people in the year above who are 7 to 18, Sam and Patrick. This is a very emotional story, as he's not only facing the trauma of his best friend killing himself, but he also has to deal with the trauma and guilt he feels for the death of his Aunt Lucy, which is a very prominent figure in the book and the movie, for a very sinister reason that we don't know until right at the end, which was the fact that when he was a child, she committed sexual assault on him, which he suppressed the memories for, until in the end scene where he loses his virginity for the first time, he starts having these memories coming back of Aunt Lucy and the disgusting things that she did for him. The reason why I chose this film is because I really wanted to have an emotional film to score, as I've done a comedy film, Pineapple Express, and the movie I saw the TV Glow, which is a very emotional film, but also has some horror elements into it. So I wanted to have a coming of age story, because this book has been a part of my life for quite a while, and I even wrote a song called The Perks of Being a Wallflower back in 2025, early 2025, for my name on Spotify, Until the Last Sunflower. So I wanted to make a homage to it by scoring it with my own skills that I have now. For the production of this, I decided to use two different synths. So I used the Tylenol N6, which is the synthesizer which I talked a lot about in my primary and secondary research, which emulates the Roland Juno 60, which is known for its classic warmth and chorus effect, which was quite big in the 80s. For example, it's been used in Wham, Aha for their biggest song, Take On Me, which is why I decided to use that, because it's so classic and I love the warmth of it. There was also another synthesizer that I decided to use, which was the SH01A, which my mum's boyfriend let me borrow for a while. So I've been experimenting a lot with that, as well as the Tylenol N6. The thing that is so good about this synthesizer, as it came out exactly the same time as the Roland Juno 60. Though this is a digital replica that came out in 2017, the original one is the Roland SH101, which came out in 1982. So, which was the exact same release year as the Roland Juno 60, which is why I loved using this digital replica of that original synth, because I wanted to have that quality and warmth that I had back then. I decided to use the Fluff Fuzz preset on the Tylenol N6, as I really thought that voice sounded a lot like the Roland Juno 60 synth, and that warmth that I wanted to capture from it, which I also used right at the end of the production, as it was more impactful and has a lot of contrast between the Roland SH01A, which had more of an electronic, like Aphex Twin kind of feel, which I used specifically for creating this mess within the score, which was to represent his mind, which is what I'll talk about later. The start of the production has a C major 7 arpeggio, which you can't hear because the frequency I shifted low and I slowly brought it up. So as I'm putting the frequency high, it's having this ear screeching sound to it, which I did on purpose, because it's like the trauma of his mind is hard to think about. And so I also use the resonance, which I learned in my research, which I learned about the filter cutoff point of the frequencies, to have this wah effect on it. So as the frequencies are going up, I'm also messing with the resonance that are going up and down, so I can also make it sound more appealing to the audience, because I didn't want it just to have that ear screeching part of it, because the audience would have gotten bored of that and they wouldn't have wanted to listen to any more. The range I put at 16 as I wanted it to be bassy and the main like kind of bass riff, which changes completely later on when I use a different bass, which is called the barking bass, which is using the Tylenol N6, which is used to make it sound like it's all clear. I copied this riff, this C major 7 arpeggio riff, and I panned it left and right by copying and pasting it onto 3 more tracks, and I slightly layered them so the timing is off, so one arpeggio is slightly late, one other is slightly behind, and one is normal, which makes it sound crazy as it's like quite minimalistic in a sense of it's very rhythmic when it's all put together, which I use to make it sound more crazy to represent Charlie's mind. To also make the bass of this riff more bassy, I put the sub oscillators all the way up, so again to just put the bass all the way up, and so it's very booming. I also put the pulse width all the way up to because I thought that and the sub bass was like the perfect tonality for this scene, as it's quite wide and also very bassy. I then also decided to cut all of the rhythmic bassy sounds of the arpeggios and cut it to the C major, and then added C note polysynth mode, which is a much more cleaner but still electric sound of the Roland SH01A, which is supposed to represent his mind clicking and him starting to realise all of this stuff that happened to him, which then turns into this like mental breakdown, as you can see in the scene which he's having. I also decided to add another layer of the Roland SH01A. I used an arpeggio again, which made the chord C major 9. I did this because I wanted it to have a really nice sounds that plays well with the C major added C note. The notes that I used are C, E, G, B, and D, which all had a different pattern, which also played with other layers, which I'll talk about later. But I used high frequency so that it would sound quite high, and I also used a high sub bass because I wanted it to sound bassy, the same way that it represents his thoughts being a bit boomy and quite strange and scary. The range was on 2, so that it was quite high up and the pitch was very high. But while he's realising these thoughts, the pitch goes back down to 4, which is supposed to represent. Then there is a C major 7 arpeggio with the notes C, E, G, and B, which is the key signature of A minor, which is being automated volume-wise to follow in the scene when he's having this mental breakdown and memories of what's happening to him. At this point in time, all of the layers that I've just said is all being automated apart from the polysynth, which is the main chords. So this was done because I wanted it to feel quite racing, quite intense, what he's feeling. And it is shown in the scene when he's first having these memories, his childhood memories. And I wanted the impact point, the climax, to be when the police come to his door about that she had passed away in the car, because that's the thought that he always thinks about mostly. Like, he has a lot of guilt for causing the death of his aunt, because she went out to buy him a birthday present and then she got hit by a car. So I wanted that impact point to be quite ironic, because you would think it would be where he realizes the truth of his sexual assault. But I wanted to be quite realistic in the sense that he still feels guilt for it. So the impact point is when they open up the door to the police being there and telling him about it, which is when the fluff fizz comes in and it uses an E minor, which turns into an E minor 7. And the reason why I used the minor chord is because I wanted it to be quite like unsettling. Not unsettling, but had like a dark sound to the chord. I learnt this by with my research on techniques I could use within a scene. So using minor chords makes the scene more like unsettling in a way. But I also use like all of the major chords to throw off the audience, as it replicates his memories being positive and negative. The technique I used of making have major and minor in the same scoring was inspired by the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. When they're on the train scene, they have motifs of each character which work well together, which I wanted to use that in the format of chords instead of motifs for people. So I wanted it to be about context, so motifs around context. So there's a motif about his guilt and a motif about the pain that he feels realising the truth about what she did to him, which I thought was very useful and good for the scene. So when that impact point and climax comes in, when the police knock on the door, I use the fluff fizz chords, which is E minor turned into E minor 7, which I've already talked about. And that's supposed to be really bright and uplifting, which is strange to the audience because they're like, why? And I did that because it's quite confusing anyway, so I wanted the confusion to be there within the score as well. You would have also noticed that the timing within this score is more consistent and it has a direction of where it's going rather than the scattered around rhythmic sound of the SH01A, which was done on purpose to make it sound confusing. But I'm using the tonal N6 preset of the fluff fizz, which is using the E minor turned into the E minor 7th chord to make it sound more consistent, which is to really replicate the acceptance and the understanding that Charlie is feeling, while also still having those racing emotions, which you can still hear in the Roland SH01A. So it's a contrast of motifs, again using context instead of character motifs. So I'm using acceptance of what happened to him, while also panic and despair, which is represented in the Roland SH01A. The consistency is portrayed with the barking bass, which is using the notes C, A, C, and F. So it goes from C to A, and back to C and then F, which is in the key of A minor, which is where the consistency comes in, because I couldn't figure out the key signature until I used the tonal N6. I'm also using not the tonal N6, but the Logic acoustic bump, which was, I thought, very electronic because I've been listening to a lot of Aphex Twin. I wanted to incorporate that within this song. So I decided to use the acoustic bump kit, which has an 808 kick, which is used a lot of electronic music, and so it makes it more deep and brooding, which is also representing the deep feelings that he's feeling in the scene. So the drums are the main consistency within the track. They're the things that are following a 4/4 time signature, following a 120 BPM, which also makes the barking bass sound more consistent, as the barking bass is following that time signature and sound of the drums. But I decided to use the 808 kick because it sounded more bassy and boomy. The main way I wanted to make it sound even more boomy is by increasing the 20 to 500 hertz. So the most increased point is 80 hertz to make it sound more boomy. But I did not cut any of the frequencies because I still wanted those higher frequencies in there. So the snare has also been increased at 300. because that's the mid-range point and where snares mostly get their snap from. So I decided to increase it there and not lower, because that would have drowned the sound of the kick within the snare as well, which I wanted to have a more balanced mix between the kick and the snare. So I increased at the mid-range point instead of the kick point. I also used claps because I thought the snare didn't sound as powerful by itself. So I used a clap sound that I did not equalize whatsoever, because I thought it sounded good by itself. For the cymbal, I used the lo-fi hype cymbal, which I thought was very appropriate for it. And I've also used reverb on that cymbal because I wanted it to sound more echoey, because I thought it sounded strange not having like a long release, as I wanted it to be more ambient and more like heard within the track. So what I did is I put the dryness up to 70% and the wetness up to 78%, because I wanted it to feel more ambient rather than lo-fi. So I made the cymbal more wet, as it matched the kind of like lost feelings that he's feeling in himself. I wanted that loss in the cymbal and the kit, like by itself. I used a high cut of 1200 hertz, so that the high ends are more heard than the low ends, and the low ends are completely cut to 6000 hertz, so that you can't hear any of the low ends, and you have the specific reverb mix of the high ends. The research I used for the scoring of The Perks of Being a Wallflower was from the 28 years later analysis of the lyrical research, and also the analysis of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, while also using the research that I did of experimenting with synthesizers. For example, the research that I used for 20 years later, for example, the lyric analysation was very useful, as I used the lyrics to reference and get an idea of where to start from in my own lyrics. For example, the lyrics "Father, let me dream, there's a million nightmares," which comes from the movie 28 Years Later, which is in reference to Spike telling his dad literally to let him dream, and also metaphorically that the nightmares are the zombies running about. I used this to find what lyrics I wanted to use in my own song "Cupid versus Disgusting Men Who Take Advantage of Little Children," and I found a lyric that kind of matched up with the metaphor of this. So I told her once, I warned her what he's about. This can also be taken literally and metaphorically, the same way that the lyric "Father, let me dream, there's a million nightmares" can be. As I told her once can literally mean that Charlie told her not to do what she's doing, which is disgusting. And also I warned her what he's about, which could also be a reference to the guilt that Spike feels, as he's like warning her of the danger in him, because he blames himself for the death of his aunt, which can also be linked to "There's a Million Nightmares," as in this context he doesn't want to go out and be an adult. He doesn't want to go onto the islands, which is in 28 Years Later, and kill the zombies, which is reference. This shows that there's a link within these lyrics about the ideas of masculinity and growing up, as the character Spike, who is in 28 Years Later, doesn't want to grow up so fast and kill animals and zombies, and he doesn't want to. He wants to stay in that youth. The same way that Charlie wants to stay in that youth. Their youth were both taken away by an adult figure. For Spike, it was his father who pushed it onto him to go out and be a man and be masculine, and show off to the village, when the age that you're supposed to leave the island is 15, when Spike was only 12. But that can also be linked to Charlie in The Perks of Being a Wallflower, because he was young, She took away his right to grow up, and that is very similar because their youth were both taken away by an adult figure. I think that's why the lyrics both work so well, because they're both begging their father to let their adult figure to remain as a child, but instead of but for Charlie, he feels a lot of guilt about the death of his aunt. I also thought it could be a double entendre for "I told him once, I want her what he's about," as it could also be his subconscious trying to warn him and make him remember about the evil things that his aunt did. But I also flipped the genders. That's why it says "I told her once, I warned her what he's about," because it shows the guilt he feels for her death. When in actuality, it would be "I told him once," him being himself, "I warned him what she is about," which references the evil plot that the evil sexual assault that his aunt committed on him. I then also decided to use the lyric "He can have her, I'll just stay right out," which was from my song "Good Versus Disgusting Men Who Take Advantage of Little Children" by Until Last Sunflower on my Between Maturity album. I used the lyric "He can have her, I'll just stay right out" to reference his mind staying in youth and being like scarred and traumatized from his experience, and so his development of growing up stops in track, and he is forever stuck in this like traumatized PTSD state that his aunt gave him, which is shown in the lyric "Stay right out," as in it's him saying that his like personality and I guess sense of growing up is staying away from him to leave room for this trauma that he has just endured. This can also be linked to the lyric "He can have her," as in Charlie, can stay with Aunt Lucy forever, which I thought was a really cool way of showing the trauma bonds that he's obviously grown to have. Side rant, this bird is really annoying. The lyric, "I guess I just don't count, I guess other kids just don't count," was also inspired by young fathers in the song "Promised Land," which is at the start of the movie. The lyric that inspired me was "Scorpion's a working man, I'm drowning in the deep," which I thought was very encrypted and very metaphoric, which I wanted to use throughout the whole of this journey of writing lyrics, which is why the lyrics that you can hear before were very metaphoric and very encrypted and needed a lot of thinking to go into for it to make sense. So this is something that I wanted to incorporate in the last lyric, the most impactful lyric. "I guess I just don't count, I guess the other kids just don't count." Now, in my analysation, I've come to find that "Scorpion's a working man, I'm drowning in the deep" is referencing the scorpion as being the man before the infected, and then him drowning in the deep as being infected. Now, the similarities are the ideologies about drowning. So, drowning in the deep is turning into the zombie, which I did not mention in my original analysation of the lyrics. I decided to keep the original lyric of "I guess I just don't count, I guess other kids just don't count" as the original meanings of that came from the song "Cupid versus Disgusting Men Who Take Advantage of Little Children." The story behind the song "Cupid versus Disgusting Men Who Take Advantage of Little Children" is a made-up story that I made about this victim is watching the person who committed sexual assault on him start dating someone that he knew, and he warns the person who he's dating now about what he did, but she won't listen and she simply does not care. And so the lyric "I guess I just don't count, I guess the other kids just don't count" is basically him saying that I guess the sexual assault didn't matter because he is going off and having this life, and he is remained unpunished because he's got a girlfriend again and he is happy. So then the reason why I kept the original meaning of this lyric was to represent the drowning part and metaphor that is linked to Scorpion's working man, I'm drowning in the deep. The way that the person is drowning in the deep, turning into a zombie, he is drowning in the reality that none of it mattered. And he had been turned into this person that he didn't want to be forcefully, the same way that the person is being drowned in the deep. So that's why I've decided to keep those lyrics the same, the original meaning the same, so that they link up together. The lyrical analysis was so useful, as I was able to use all of these metaphors that represent and have a background of the character. For example, Charlie. This is links back to Charlie, as he is too drowning, knowing that his aunt did this disgusting thing to him, and he had no memory of it. And it's all coming back up now when he lost his virginity for the first time. So all these lyrics are supposed to have a background of the character, have a background of sexual assault, so it has a bigger meaning within the movie, which is why it's such a deep analysis of the lyrics, and why I've not talked so much about Charlie when I've talked about the lyrical analysis, because it's very in-depth, which is perfect for how I wanted this movie score to turn out, because I wanted it to be very, very encrypted, as I've said at the start, but I also wanted it to represent the movie, which is why there's a lot of linkage between the song that the lyrics come from, Cupid versus Disgusting Men Who Take Advantage of Little Children, the inspiration that I've used to use those lyrics 28 years later, and him being forced to turn into an adult and go onto the mainland and kill the zombies, and him having to be traumatized by the horrors that he's witnessing, and the movie The Perks of Being a Wallflower. All of these link up together to create this form of youth and being forced to grow up, which I think was very useful for how I wanted the score to sound, with the mix of the synths. I've also used the research of the poem. The poem was very, very useful, as when I was wanting to write lyrics, I realised that I could use the Cupid versus Disgusting Men Who Take Advantage of Little Children as the lyrical part of the score that I wanted to use originally, which can be seen being the same kind of technique used for the poem Boots, which wasn't written for the film originally, but has been used to represent the movie anyway. So the poem talks about soldiers losing their mind, about constantly seeing Boots going up and down, and how they're physically fine but mentally gone, which represents the monsters, the zombies in 28 years later. As physically they're fine, but mentally they're going after humans and trying to kill them and eating them, which is, I thought, was very interesting, the way that they've used that lyric, which had something that was completely different, but they've managed to incorporate into a movie which makes sense, which is why I use Cupid versus Disgusting Men as Little Children as the same technique used. I've also used the motif research that I did in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, about how motifs are there to paint pictures of characters, but instead of characters, I've chosen to use context, and, for example, acceptance, and also PTSD responses. So the synthesizers so the SH01A synthesizer is representing very intense feelings and emotions about what happened to him as a kid, which is why there's so much more fast and rhythmic elements in the song. But while that's going on, there's a part of the score which uses the tonal N6, which then puts away the rhythmic capabilities and makes the song have a time signature a BPM, and a direction to go for all of the elements to combine and make something that is cohesive with each other and a full score. For example, the Tylenol N6 synth Fluff Fuzz creates room and headspace for drums to kicking and create a beat that is a 4/4 time signature, which then can be followed by the barking bass, which makes this score, the acceptance that he is feeling and realization that what happened to him wasn't right. But while he is feeling this acceptance of what happened to him was real, he's also having all these feelings and fast thoughts go on about him, which can be represented in the Roland SH01A, as it doesn't stop, it just keeps going, but it's also being fought against with the motif of acceptance. This can be seen when, on the train scene of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Joel and Clementine each have a motif that represent each other in a rhythmic manner. For example, the bassoon represents Clementine and is very charismatic in that scene, and has a lot more rhythmic tendencies than the brass, which represents Joel, which very much so replicates their character, as Clementine's very fast-paced and very all over this place, but Joel's very shy and he keeps to himself, which is why you don't hear as much brass as you do bassoon. Which is why I used those. Which is why I used that research for the motif of acceptance and fast thoughts. So I use this this motif technique of having one play off the character and another play off another character to represent one representing acceptance and one representing this denial and fast-paced emotions, which is represented by the Roland SH01A, which is a very electronic and booming sound because of the sub-bass oscillators, while the Tylenol N6 is quite a clean, cohesive sound, which is why it is representing acceptance, as it's very much more clear, and why it drives this clearer path of structure within the song, for example, the 4/4 time signature and the 120 BPM. And that was my the production of The Purpose of Being a Wallflower. The mix was also good. I used sidechain compression to I put all of the synthesizers into bus 17, and I put that bus into a compressor, which the sidechain then goes into the kick of the drum kit that I talked about earlier. So I put the sidechain compression on threshold 16.5 dB, the ratio at 6.1 to 11. I had no makeup, I had the attack at 8 and the release at 150 .ms, so it would sound wow, done a lot. And the reason why I put the attack there was I wanted it to sound quite immediate, having a low attack, but the release to have more time for the synthesizers to come back in, which is why I put the release and attack there. And I also put threshold quite high at 16.5 dB because I wanted the kick to be very powerful. The ratio was to make it even more powerful as well, which is linking back to the threshold. I use Silver Reverb for the mastering channel, putting the dryness at 91% and the wetness at 43%, because I think reverb really makes the mastering of the whole sound so much better and beautiful, especially with this very ambient style track. I put the high cut to 6,000 Hz and the low cut of 41,000 Hz because I wanted more of a bassier track, which is also why I put the EQ increase at 93 Hz, because I wanted to stay quite bassy. I didn't use the equalizing techniques that talks about vocals. When you decrease at 6k Hertz so that you can make room for the vocals, and then increasing those same frequencies on the vocal channel. As this scene is very much so an ambient carnage release, which is supposed to represent all these intense emotions. And so that is why I did that on purpose, because it's supposed to be quite intense and it's supposed to be loud, and the score is supposed to be pushed out there rather than being under the vocals, because it's at the end of it and it's got all these flashbacks and him having a breakdown and all these memories that are flooding towards him, which is why I did that. One more thing about the mixing, I also I put the gain down on the inputs of the Roland SH01A, because when I was recording it I found the gain to be quite loud, as it wasn't a MIDI synth. I actually had to plug it into an audio interface and record it on there, which is why the gain was so big. So I reduced that to 12.8 dB down to make it sound better.